things sometimes hit you out of the blue. Ever been pooped on by a bird? Right? Okay, out of the blue, I think literally like out of the sky, something that's very surprising to you. One of Anya's teachers several years ago, I think it was Anya's teacher, one of the girls' teachers, was walking along the field trip from St. Peter's, but it was something downtown, so they were able to have a walking field trip. So she's walking along, leading her class, and suddenly a squirrel jumps into her hair out of the tree. Yeah, she jumped, she screamed. It just, again, out of the blue. You do not see this coming whatsoever. I'm sure that you guys have had things happen to you out of the blue, things that surprise you. It could be, a phone call, it could be a diagnosis, it could be literally something that hits you, an accident that happens. Today we're going to see in Genesis Abraham, or Abram, as he is called at this point in the story, and how God appears to him, as far as we can tell, out of the blue. God speaks to him just completely without precedent, just boom, there he is. So if you want to turn our Bibles here to Genesis chapter 12, I think I've got slides up there. I don't have sermon notes for you. And I'm trusting this is what God has for me, because I tried to get these things to save on my computer, and it just would not work. So I'm like, okay, Lord, I'm just going to surrender to this, and we're not going to worry about doing sermon notes. There will be some things I share that you probably will want to write down, and so you may just need to scribble them on your bulletin someplace. But just due to those tech problems, I wasn't able to do that. Okay, so a review of the book of Genesis. Genesis is the book of beginnings. And so we see in the first chapters, you get the beginning of creation, the physical realm, the beginning of mankind, the beginning of marriage, the beginning of sin that happens. You see the first murder that happens. You see the beginning of languages, and you see the beginning of judgment that happens as well. All these things happen in the first chapters of Genesis. And the first 3 chapters of Genesis, first 11 chapters are very broad brushstrokes. And then when you get to chapter 12, it zooms in on the life of one individual. And as God begins to work with this one individual as his means of reaching all of the world. So Genesis chapter 12, when we pick up in Genesis 12, God has been silent, at least as far as the biblical record is concerned, for about 300 years, since he last talked with Noah. And so we get a little bit behind the scenes stuff that was revealed to us, but when it comes to God actually speaking to a person, he's been silent for about 300 years. And then all of a sudden we see in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country, from your relatives, and from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." This is a wonderful call on his life. Now, what's Abram's background? We could back up into chapter 11 and see a little bit of it. I'm just going to take 2 verses from chapter 11 to see a little bit of his background. Let's go to 11:31. "Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, and his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. They went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and then Terah died in Haran." Now, I think the next slide I have here is a map. This is going to give you a picture of where these places are. Now, that vast brown spot in the middle of this map is a desert. Okay, so just think of this as being as inhospitable and uncrossable as an ocean. Okay, so when they go from Ur, and there's a couple different Urs, and we're not exactly sure which one this is. There's the northern Ur, and there's the southern Ur. But either way, there was a traveling from Ur into Haran. But it says that they went in order to enter the land of Canaan. But they stopped in Haran along the way. So they left Ur, whichever one it was. They went to Haran, but they were en route to Canaan, but they ended up stopping in Haran along the way. Now, the area of Ur was a pagan area. It was an idolatrous area. And we get a little bit of a background about Terah and about Abram's family in which he grew up. If we go to Joshua chapter 24, verse 2. This is what Joshua says to the people in, let's go to the next slide there, Jerry. Okay. Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, from ancient times your fathers lived beyond the river, namely Terah, the father of Abraham, and the father of Nahor, and they served other gods. So Abram was actually from a pagan, idolatrous, polytheistic family. Now, why did God choose to invade this man's life, to hit him out of the blue with a call on his life? We're not really told. But it just kind of came out of the blue, and Abram, we will find out, he obeyed. Now, God's call on Abram and how he responded comes in different ways. Abram is called the father of faith, but his faith grew over time. And what we're going to see is his faith maybe wasn't as strong at the beginning as it was later on, which is really the case for most of us. Our faith usually starts out and then it grows and grows, hopefully, it's growing stronger and stronger over time. So I'm going to give you a few little, they're biblically consistent lessons here, but they're not necessarily from one particular verse, okay? So this first one here is if you are listening, you will hear God's calling. If you are listening, you will hear God calling to you. But you have to be attentive. You have to be listening. Now, let's look a little more carefully at Genesis 12, 1 through 3. The first verse there is the command. It's the command to go. And the command to go was not just a command to get moving, but it was also a command to leave behind. So he says, go forth from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house. So these are concentric circles, okay? Go forth from your country, your clan, and from your father's house, and then go to the land which I will show you. So he's leaving behind all the familiar. He's probably leaving behind a place of familiar language, familiar culture, and by leaving his father's house, he's leaving behind his inheritance that he would have gotten as well. I don't know for sure that Abram was the firstborn. He's the first one listed amongst his brothers, but he would be leaving whatever inheritance he had by going out. But he counted it as worthwhile because what had God promised him? In the next two verses, okay, God says, I will make you a great nation. Okay, that means he's going to multiply his descendants. He's going to actually become the size of a whole nation of people. I will bless you. I will give you a great reputation. That's what it means by making your name great. And so you shall be a blessing. Literally, you could also translate that and be a blessing, like as a command. It's like you shall be a blessing or be a blessing. So God intends for Abram to be one who's going to bless others. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. This is protection that God promises him. And then also, he gives him a prophecy about the future. It says, in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed, which, of course, Abram could not have realized at the time. But he was going, from his descendants would come Jesus, who would be a blessing to the entire earth as well. So a couple other little lessons for us here. One, God's will is often revealed one step at a time. God does not always lay the whole path out for us. Oftentimes he doesn't. He says, this is where I want you to go, next step. And then next step, one step at a time. We kind of get the information on a need-to-know basis. Now, second, embracing what God has for you in the future often requires leaving something behind. So sometimes you have to empty out of yourself that you may be filled. You have to let go of the old in order to embrace the new. You can think about this when God called the disciples to follow him. Matthew left his tax booth, right, to follow Jesus. The fishermen, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, they left their fishing nets in order to follow Jesus. When God called Peter out of the boat, he had to leave the security of the boat behind to walk out on the water. God often calls us to leave behind something in order to come and follow after him, to receive the better that he has for us. So, as we're talking about calling, has God placed a calling on your life? Has he called you to something, and then maybe you have only, you've not been willing to fully let go of the old in order to embrace the new? And that's what we see with Abraham here. So in Acts chapter 7, Acts 7 is Stephen's defense before the Sanhedrin. And so he gives a little bit of a sermon, kind of an Old Testament lesson to the Sanhedrin. And as he's doing it, this is what he says. Hear me, brethren and fathers, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran. and said to him, "Leave your country and your relatives and come into the land I will show you." Then he left for the land of Chaldeans and settled in Haran. Now, if you're kind of reconciling this with what we just read in Genesis 12, okay, this quote in verse 2 is actually what God said in Genesis 12:1. But in Genesis 12, we tend to think that this is something that came to him when he was in Haran, because it says that they went to Haran, then it gives us God's blessing and call on Abraham. But chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis are different than chapters 12 and following. It's kind of like the broad brushstrokes that are the introduction, then we zoom in on the one life. And Stephen gives us insight that God's call to Abram actually came in Ur. It did not come when he was already in Haran. So God called him when he was in Ur, "Go to the land I will show you," and he went as far as Haran, and then he stopped. It says that he settled in Haran. How many times do we settle short of what God has for us? Haran was not the promised land. It was not the place that God was going to give him as an inheritance, but he settled there. And he also did not leave his father's country, or his father's family. He brought his father with him to Haran. And so his obedience was incomplete. It was partial. Here's another lesson for us. Taking what God tells you to leave behind will hold you back. Taking with you what God tells you to leave behind is going to hold you back. They settled with a halfway obedience. Now let's go back to Genesis chapter 12, because we're going to see that Abraham does grow in his obedience. He eventually does what God tells him to do, and he keeps moving. Genesis 12, we're going to read verses 4 through 7. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. Now the Canaanite was then in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. He gains greater clarity, because in verse 7 it says, "To your descendants I will give this land." That was not something he was told previously. And so he gained greater clarity, but when did that clarity come? When he had taken another step of obedience. When he had left behind Haran, he left behind his father. I think his father may have actually died at that point. It's a little unclear on that. But he moved on, but yet he still took Lot with him. His obedience was not fully in place. But he took another step of obedience. God gave him greater clarity. And sometimes, this is our next lesson here, the greater light only comes after we walk in the light that we already have been given. So if you want to have God reveal more to you, are you being faithful with all he has already revealed to you? So walk in the light you've been given, and God will give you greater light as you progress along. Now, is there any place where your obedience has been partial? Where God has called you to do something and you've maybe taken a step that way, but you've not gone all the way? Or he's called you to leave something behind and you've left some of it behind, but maybe not all of it behind. So for each one of us, this may be different, but if God has called you to full obedience, don't stop with just a partial obedience. Now, as he goes to the land of Canaan, and Lot goes with him eventually, because their possessions are so great, they find out, and this is in chapter 13, that the land cannot support all of them. I'm assuming there's just not enough pasture for all their flocks and herds and stuff, and it gets to be conflict over those resources between Lot's herdsmen and the herdsmen of Abram. And so Abram says, hey, let's not have strife. We're family here, so why don't you pick what direction you want to go, and I'll go the other direction. We'll part ways. And so Lot, he looks up and he sees all around, but as he looks down towards the Jordan River, towards the valley that is there, and he realizes, wow, that is lush down there. He chooses the best land for himself. Abram lets him do that. But as he parts from Lot, finishing up that obedience that God had said about departing from his family, God has another bit of clarity to give him, another promise to give him. And this is in Genesis 13, verses 14 to 17. Then the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you." So God says, all of this is yours. Look around, 360 degrees, and it's all yours, which would include the land that was taken by Lot. And so he says, I'm going to give it all to you. You trust in me, and you are going to get all of this. Here's our next lesson. Obedience opens doors for God's blessings. Obedience opens doors for God's blessings. But obedience requires a resource that we sometimes have in short supply. And for this last bit, we're going to go to Hebrews chapter 11, verses, I'm going to start in verse 8. But Hebrews 11 is the hall of faith. And this is that resource that we sometimes seem to have in short supply, because we will not obey if we don't have faith. So Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 10, this is a commentary on Abraham's life. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, and in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the promise, for he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. He went out not knowing where he was going. And this is important for us to understand, that where you are going, I don't know if this is the next slide I have up here, Jerry, but this is the next lesson. Yeah. Where you are going isn't as important as who is calling you to go. And that's really the essence of this message this morning. If you're asking the when or the where or the why, those are not necessarily going to have the answers. But if you know the who, that's the answer for you. If you know the who, if you know that God is calling you, those other questions will work themselves out. So, God, why do you want me to do this? Why are you taking me through this? Why are you calling me to that? He's like, am I calling you? Well, what do you want me to do when I get there? I'm calling you. But when do you want me to go? I'm calling you. Where's this land that you're going to take me? I'm calling you. It is I who am calling. So if God is the one who is calling, you don't have to worry about it. Now, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1 says this. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. You are not necessarily going to see it. And if you do see it, you may not see it in a way that you can actually take hold of it. This is what the last little bit here from Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 to 16. And I'm getting ready to wind down here, Walt. Okay, Hebrews chapter 11, verses 13 to 16. All of these, and this is a lot more people than just Abraham, all of these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they had went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So when Abraham was, when Abraham was dwelling in the promised land, it says that he was living in tents. He was a sojourner. He was a pilgrim. He was a temporary resident. But he was looking forward to a city that had foundations. And it says God was the one building this. So he did not settle down and build cities. He did not settle down and build houses. He trusted God has this for me in the future. God's going to do this in the future, but not now. But he trusted that what God said was true. Now, when I think of the different people in the scriptures who have a calling from God, I find that Abraham's still a little bit unique amongst most of them. Because, again, with the disciples who Jesus called to follow him, he did say, follow me. So they had a focus there. Okay, follow me. Jonah, right, and Moses, They were called to go to Egypt, Jonah to Nineveh and Moses to Egypt. Now, those guys took a little more convincing, right? But they knew where they were going, right? Gideon, you as mighty warrior, I want you to defeat the Midianites. He knew what he was supposed to do. Jesus, he was led out into the wilderness. Then he was led to the cross, but he knew what he was going to do. Abraham was not told what he was going to do. Go to the land that I will show you. This is going to be different. This is going to be different than what you have experienced before. Sometimes God is going to call us to go and to do something that is uncertain. You're stepping out, and so I don't know what the call is that God has been working on your heart. Some of you may be thinking back to a call that God has already given you. Some of you, it may be that God is going to be calling you, and this is preparatory for what God is doing. But when God does call, remember, focus on the who. God, you're the one calling. I don't have to have all the details right now because I trust that you are going to get me there. Now, when you're traveling, I know a lot of us have it, our cars are newer. We've got like a little console there with a map on it, right, in our car. Used to, we had to pull out an atlas and find our way if we wanted to, or somebody could give us written directions, go until you see this stop sign, turn right, go 2 miles, whatever. But how much better is it when you don't have to fill with all the map because you've got somebody with you that knows the way? If the person sitting in your passenger seat knows the way, they're okay, just keep going. Okay, now at this stop, turn right, and they just give you the directions. It takes so much pressure off. That's really the way it is in following God's will. He knows where you're going. If you just stay in touch with him, he doesn't have to lay out all the instructions. He doesn't have to give a map. He can just give you the information as you need to know it. Now, this morning has been somewhat of a secondhand sermon. Now, I say that not because this is a sermon that I got from another preacher, but because of the fact that this sermon has been working on me for the last 2 weeks. And so it's been preaching to me, and now I'm, delivering it onto you. And the reason is because God has been speaking to me and speaking to us with a call as well. And that God is actually leading us away from Bethel. But this is kind of like an Abraham call in the fact that we don't know when, and we don't know where, and we don't know exactly why. I mean, he's given us little indications on some of these things, but God has spoken to both Amanda and I. We have sought counsel from other people. We've spent time in prayer, and we are certain that God is leading us to step away from Bethel. But it is very similar to the picture that I have is you're in a room, and a door is open, and God's on the other side saying, come. It's not that we're leaving because there's conflict or a crisis. It's not leaving because it's like, oh, I failed and it's just time to move on or anything. It's really that God is opening the door and it's an invitation. He's inviting us into something new. Now, we know that what he has is good, and we know that what he has for Bethel on the other side of this is good. But I met with the elders yesterday, Kurt and Walt and John, and I shared this with them as well. I asked them to keep it very confidential because I wanted to make sure that I had a chance to just kind of tell the whole congregation together at one time. Again, we don't know the timeline on this. We think that it will probably be in terms of months. We don't expect that we will probably be here in 2026, but we really don't know what God has for us. But I share this with you now. One is because of the fact I want your prayers on our behalf because we don't know. And we need that discernment. I also want you to be praying for our church. And I feel like God has given me some things that we can focus on in the coming months as we try to prepare Bethel for this transition. I'll share those in a future time. But I also wanted to give the church lead time as well because it can take a long time for a church to find a pastor. And so I wanted to let the leadership of the church know so that they can begin that process because sometimes that takes a while. And so I know that this news it's a shock. It's not a shock to Amanda and I because God's been brewing this in us for months now. as we've been seeking him on this. But I wanted to share that with you so you guys heard it directly from me and to understand that we don't know what, we don't know when, maybe have a few indications of why, because, Amanda and I are both kind of weary. We could use a change. We could use a break. And it's not because of the fact that the church is like super demanding or anything like that. It's just that pastoring is just by nature, it's a unique role. So we could use some time of refreshment. We could also use some time of retooling. There's some things that God is revealing about me and about us that he wants to work on in us. But I also know, too, that he has been brewing in my heart a few different desires. He has brought across my path a couple of young men that I've been investing in, and it's really stirred my desire to invest in young people. And so I think that God may have something like that in our future. But we're not really sure. I've also had God brewing in me this concept of a house church, like what Gary Rowland, our missionary in New York City, and his wife Kelly are doing. My friend Jeff is doing that. And so I don't know if God has something like that for us in the future. But I wanted to share with all of you and say, I love you so much. And I am going to, when the time comes, and that's not today, okay, that I will miss you dearly. And but I know that because of the who, he's going to take care of us. He's going to take care of y'all. And we're going to have our closing song. Yeah, Daryl, go ahead.
I think that we're going to be fine. All of the close with you. I'm excited about where he's going. And we're going.
So Daryl just threatened to go, or offered to go with us when we leave. Yeah, we really don't. Now, one thing it is not our hope to leave the community. We will go where God leads us, but we hope to still be around. We don't want to really uproot our kids as they're in high school, and we'd love to be able to have them finish out, where they're at right now. You can go ahead. I think this closing song, though it's very familiar to you, will probably take on a new level of meaning, both based on the message as well as how I've concluded the message today with this announcement. But I'm hoping that this will be encouraging for all of us to go where it is that God leads us.
I can hear myself.